Good evening. My name is Father Ben Shambaugh. I'm the priest here at St. Luke's, and I want to welcome you and welcome the East Hampton Historical Society for this event tonight. This is the first of a series, so I hope we'll be welcoming you many times this winter. If you're new to this space, I just want to tell you the restrooms are just to the right down the hallway here. You'll see them. And if you go farther down the hallway and then take a left, you'll go into the church itself. And if you've never been here, I encourage you to do that on a break or after the program is over. Again, welcome to St. Luke's, and I want to introduce to you, you all know, Steve Long.
Thank you so much to Father Ben. We're very excited to be here at Hoey Hall, the Historical Society. We have lots of Hoey paintings ourselves, so it's a very historic space and so great to be all over the community. I also wanted to welcome you to our first in the series of our winter lecture series. As Father Ben said, I'm Steve Long, the Executive Director of the East Hampton Historical Society, and tonight really thrilled to have Randy Kolhoff talk about the historical photography of William G. Howard. Before giving a brief introduction of Randy, I wanted to also give a special thank you to our past board president, Hillary Osborne Malecki, who is the one who suggested we invite Randy to speak. So without Hillary, Randy wouldn't be here. So thank you so much. Just one of the many things Hillary did as board president. Randy Kolhoff is the owner of Black Swan Antiques, which is located in Sag Harbor, if you've not been there, right in the village. The store was started 18 years ago in Southampton. Like me, Randy is from away. He grew up in and also was educated in Utah and moved to the East End, wisely, 25 years ago, where he lives today in Sag Harbor with his 2 daughters. And he has an amazing story not only about the photographer himself, but also how he found these historical documents, which he's going to tell us about this evening. So please, will you join me in welcoming Randy.
Thank you, Steve, for the introduction, and thank you for having me. I appreciate, I love seeing so many people interested in history and enough to come out on a cold night and soak up a little bit of storytelling. So, being an antiquary over the years, people wander into my shop all the time, and they've always have a story of something that they think is valuable. And unfortunately, 9.9 times out of 10, they're watching too much antique roadshows. But on occasion, somebody wanders in with a story, and this story begins several years back, before I found the negatives, which was in 2020. There was a gentleman by the name of Chris, and he grew up in Sag Harbor, and he used to come into my shop all the time, and he would always have these interesting little pieces of local history and a story. He grew up there, and he would tell me how they would go down to Otter Pond at low tide, and back in the day, Otter Pond in Sag Harbor and the lower harbors were filled, well they still are, but what would happen is the freshwater springs would come up in Otter Pond in the lower harbor, and back in the day they would put big oak barrels down over the springs, so at low tide you could go in and get fresh water out of the springs that wasn't affected by the brackish water. It was a way of harvesting fresh water. So him and his buddies figured this out in their teens, and they would go down at low tide and dig up these oak barrels that were buried down there, and then wheel them into town and sell them at the antique markets. So he would tell me the story, but he was still doing the same thing to me. He would bring in these interesting items. One example he brought in, the building that I occupy, my store occupies, is on Main Street, 26 Main. And it used to be the post office up until I believe the 1930s. So one day he brings me in the header of the post office where it has money orders, mail, all oak, all from the early part of the last century. And I said, where'd you get, you want to buy it? I'll buy it. I ended up, over the years buying several pieces from him. So one day in July of 2020, a woman comes in, the last name is Brown, and she says to me, I have this old barn. My family has had this piece of property for the last 200 years. We're selling it. Would you like to come and look at my barn? I'm like, well, can you tell me a little bit more? And she goes, well, I can tell you that Chris has been coming in here over the last several years and selling you things out of the barn. And I said, oh, yes, that barn. Yes, I'll gladly come and look at your barn. So, make sure I get this guy working for me. Okay, so this is a picture, this is a photograph of the barn. Okay, so I go in to look at it with Miss Brown, and when I walked in, the first thing is dust from just opening the door, because nobody had literally gone through it. Apparently Chris was just taking things that were on the side, because stuff was piled up to my eyesight level with God knows what. We found out through time it was literally dead animals. There were a full carriage was in there, suitcases filled with clothes, but literally nobody had gone through the contents of it in over 200 years. So what turned out to be, through a lot of the research that I found out subsequently, was that the Brown family had owned the pharmacy. And there was a bunch of accoutrements from the pharmacy inside there as well, which was really fascinating. So I bought the whole contents. I said, I'll give you a price for everything. I bought everything. And I said, I'll bring my guys in, we'll spend a couple of days, we'll go through it all. Whatever we can't use, we'll take to the dump. Whatever we can use, will be part of the purchase. So as we were going through that first level, because they also had an upstairs to it, we were just pulling things out and putting them alongside and sorting through it. So what I found out about the pharmacy was that the Brown family had the pharmacy located on Washington Street, and above it was the photo studio of William G. Howard. So in the back corner were these cases. You can see the cases had rotted through. Right here you can see a lot of the cases themselves had rotted, and unfortunately the glass plate negatives had just waterfalled down, and you can see where they had just gone down and shattered into multiple fragments of glass, and you can see they're unprotected. So this barn had no insulation. It literally, I was told, is one of the oldest barns still standing on Long Island. So there wasn't a lot of weather protection, as you can see. Everything there was exposed. So unfortunately, I would say maybe half of all of the images were lost to time. But not knowing that they were there, I went to Mrs. Brown and I explained to her what I had found in the back corner and asked her if she knew what they were or anything at all. She said, well, because this was a several day process, she took a box of them, a small box, because the full boxes were probably about 90 pounds because it's all glass stacked side to side. She took a small box home, and then the next day my guys and I came back. She brought back the small box, she gave it to me, and she said, these are none of my relatives, this has nothing to do with us, it's included in the sale. I still had no idea what was in there, because from most of what I could see, there were just people. I had no idea of its historical significance or if there was any value at all in them, because most of the time people don't really care to look at strangers they don't know, and I didn't know the time frame either. So it was through some of the boxes I located. I found, this is W.G. Howard, and I found all the paperwork pertaining to his business, including checks, bills, his advertising spend, like every kind of bill you could imagine was in there. How much he paid for his film paper, how much he paid for his glass, everything was included in there. So I knew it was his studio. I didn't know anything about him, so I teamed with the local Sag Harbor Historical Society, and they had some idea of his work and a few of some of his tintypes and glass negatives that had been found before. So they were able to fill me in a little bit about who he was and his work. But this kind of archive, I would probably guess, I haven't done an official count, but I would probably guess there's upwards of maybe 3,000 images, probably. This is just a collection of places that I've located. Some of them were so damaged that they were, I wasn't able to retrieve them. Some of them, had water damage. I literally had one box with the remains of a dead raccoon's skeleton on top. Yeah, it was pretty wild. And we took him off, and then, we salvaged a lot of that glass. But I'll show you here. This is an example of a really damaged piece. And it just so happened my major in college was, my first was graphic art. So I had learned Photoshop and actually been quite good at it. So it's really ironic that I find this trove of images that I can repair over the last several years to come up with what ended up to be our book. And it took 2 years to do. And this is one that's kind of beyond fixing just because of some of the damage. I didn't want to do anything that would change the structure of the image and present it in a way that was made up or false. I wanted to keep everything as true as possible. So if it was a touch-up, I did it, but if it was an overall restoration, I didn't bother. But you can see some of the damage on the top. But the rest of these I'm going to show you are a collage of what's in the book. Some that aren't in the book, but you'll appreciate. So this is just a little bio on Howard. He was born in Greenport in 1857, and he died in Sag Harbor in 1915. Now, his father was a photographer in Greenport, and so he was a second generation, and I think that really attributed to his skill set as a photographer, because you'll see some of these images, they're just phenomenal, and to be able to take them with a box camera and capture what he's done over time is beyond talent. So I think being a second generation photographer added to his skill set. And in the beginning of the early 1900s, he was even photographing images out on the East End so that they could use them for backdrops, for reproducing in the city for different plays that had to do with the East End, one specifically called Sag Harbor. So he was pretty well renowned as a photographer throughout New York. So a lot of his pictures, the majority of what you're going to see today spans between 1887, when he first opened his studio in Sag Harbor, until 1914. He died in 1915, but he spent the majority of his last year quite ill, and I think probably the majority of what he did in 1914 was very early. So this is a great shot of Main Street. You can see it all tree-lined in Sag Harbor before the great elm disease killed off all the elm trees. And the one thing about this image I had no idea was that that spire for the Whalers Church lined up straight with the middle of town if you're looking at it from the windmill straight down, which I had no idea. Being blocks off of Main Street, I never would have envisioned that it was designed that way. It's quite beautiful. This is a great image of Division Street looking straight down. Our favorite little cilantros place would be up there on your right, and you have the watch case factory here on your left. Now you can see how bright and the shadows that are cast. And I don't know much about the photography that he used with the big box, but it seems that the bright light or bright days, he'd photograph outside, and I guess it's a way of controlling the light, but most of them are either really, really bright days or in his studio. Now this is a great image of, one of the best images I've ever seen of the Alvin Silver building, which was on Main Street until 1923, when it was lost to a fire on New Year's Day. The interesting thing about what happened after, this is where Sylvester's is now on Main Street. So this building burnt out in 1923 and then stayed half burnt out on Main Street until the early 1930s. And then they used the New Deal money, money that was allocated for the New Deal, to take it down brick by brick. And then they used all of the bricks to build Marine Park. So if you were to dig under Marine Park today, that whole building is under there. But it's such a beautiful building. And then there's the image of the bank. This was Peconic Bank at the time. And now it's Apple. This image was taken on Havens Beach. You can see in the back, Barcelona neck. And again, the stoic people seldomly smiling. But he did a really, really beautiful job of capturing everything in full focus all the way back. This is, again, the elm trees lining the streets of Main Street. This is looking north from on Main Street, farther down. So where the person is on the bike, to the right would be the library, John Germain. This is an image on Burke Street in Sag Harbor, and that's the watch case factory in the back. I love the hitching post here in the foreground. Just imagine walking up there and putting your horse up for the moment. This is an image of the drawbridge that was on Main Street that led to North Haven. Again, the Alvin Silver building. So you see the post office sign there on the Alvin Silver building? That was also in the barn, and it's now in my store, which is pretty neat to find. But I love the lifestyle photographs. You'll see through it, he does seem to capture life at the time. You know, he would set it up and take a picture. He would do a lot of the posed images, but he did a lot of the, how we're living photographs, which are great. And this is Otter Pond. And everyone noticed how dressed they are with their ties and their jackets. And I mean, this is straight out of a Norman Rockwell picture. And you've got the caretaker's house on the top, which looks identical today. So that water, as everyone knows, is brackish nowadays. But what I found out through doing the research was that the caretaker who was in charge of Massachusetts Park, he would block off the tunnel, which would allow the brackish water to come in the wintertime. He would block that off so that the spring-fed water that came from the Long Pond Greenbelt would fill up and freeze completely over. Because as we know now, if it does freeze over, but no one in their right mind would dare walk out there. So I was always curious, how is it possible? But then apparently that man who lived in the house who blocked off the water would have horrible nightmares about that brackish water flowing in and flooding everybody out while they were ice skating. And there's notes of that in the Historical Society in Sag Harbor. John Germain Library. Beautiful picture of the building. Also included in these photos, I found that somehow Howard had photographed the plans for the library. So I have the blueprints photographed by him of the library, which are really neat because all the details are there. This is an iconic street of Sag Harbor. This is Henry Street looking down. So Harbor Market would be on your right, and you'd be looking towards Madison. I love this image because they look so happy. You know, they're obviously living a good life. You know, got a cart and a horse, and they're all dressed pretty well, but yeah, they lack smiles. But beautiful image, and again, this would be taken right in front of his studio on Washington Street. One of my favorite images. This is looking. So on your right-hand side, you would have the Whaling Museum, and that's looking down. That's literally my drive home every day. And so in the spring, there's a certain time of day where this it just looks exactly the same. And it's quite iconic. I mean, minus the horse and carriages and the street lights. You can see the street lights up there. See them with the goosenecks? So in editing, I would notice these throughout, and looking around town, I realized they're still out there. If you look up sometimes, you'll see them hanging. They would change out the lights, but still leave these gooseneck lamps out and around. Everybody knows that, where Madison meets Main Street. And in the back there, on a ladder, there's a handyman who's climbing up there, and that ladder looks like nothing I would be caught dead on. It looks like they just made it with whatever sticks they could find. And then this is a really great image. So you see this right here? This is a trough, and right above it, there's two lights. So it would light the trough so that the horses could drink from it. But if you look today, this piece right here was moved right behind the monument, and it sits with flowers today, but it's still there. But yeah, it used to sit in the middle of the road for the horses to drink. And this is a church that's on Latham and Division. It still looks identical today, except it's private residence, like several other churches in town. Massachusetts Park with really, really small trees. Again, that's Main Street. There's two women here with Victorian dresses on, which I'm pretty sure he's staged. And then, on Sag Harbor, we love our Whalers Fest, whale days. So this building here is, this would be taken in front of page 63 today. Again, super happy. I think it must have been bad luck to smile back then. This is Pearson School. So this is the pay house, because there was a pay toll house between Bridgehampton and Sag Harbor. So the sign up there, which I magnified a million times to get, I could read it. And then keep in mind that from these negatives, all this time has passed, and it's still clear enough to read that little sign taken that long ago. And the sign reads, "All persons are forbidden from removing soil or trees along the property of the Sag Harbor Bullhead Turnpike under penalty of law." Captain C, that part I can't read, it's not illegible, but that's it. That's kind of a neat concept to think that somebody owned that property and said, if you want to get from Sag Harbor to Bridgehampton, it's going to cost you. This is a really neat picture for several reasons. It shows the tracks that used to go on the train out to the wharf here, so you could load and unload the ships. And then when I was doing research I found the article about the dedication of this flagpole. It was purchased by several of the prominent figures in Sag Harbor, including Fairs, who own the watch case factory, and several other men who put together the funds to put this flagpole in. And in the article, it said that when they were finished, they were going to surround it with a iron fence made right here. This iron fence is all made from the barrels of guns from the Civil War. And they have the bayonets on top of them. So there's bayonets attached to the barrels, and that's what made the fence. And you can look at it here, you can see how they're offset on the bayonets, which I never would have known unless I came across that article about the dedication of the flagpole. But they had to bring these giant granite pieces down here that were 9 foot by 12 foot to support the footing for the flag, and they had to ship them in from Connecticut, and I can only imagine how difficult it was to move. And then I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Malloy building at the end of town, Sag Harbor, that occupies now Xavier's. The Sag Harbor gym would be located right here. And this one is interesting the way he staged it, because you have this gentleman who works for the Sag Harbor Grain Company, right? And look at these aristocrats with their suits and ties on, you know, in their fancy car. And then you have this guy who's schlepping oil, right? And then this guy who's just lucky to have one horse. And he's taking hay there. So it's like he got a cross-section of people for his photograph. And again, paying attention to his detail. It's quite fascinating the way he got a full cross-section of who would be using the Sag Harbor Grain Company for the photograph. This would be off of where Marine Park would be. And this is straight looking down that dock. So again, aesthetically, his eye was fantastic. His skill set to get that water captured, phenomenal. But the details here, the water and everything, and the sky, if you can imagine removing 500 specks of dust through all of this to finally get this finished product was a bit of a challenge. That's why it took 2 years to get the book out. These are two of the ships that were owned by Havens, which owned Cor Maria at the time. And these were his two boats. And there's a story that I just heard the other day from the Sag Harbor Yacht Club that they had written stories about him racing these two boats. And they thought maybe this would be the race, but I pointed out there's people in Victorian garb eating right there, so I'm pretty sure nobody was racing. These are the sailing boat races. They still hold every Wednesday in Sag Harbor. It's cropped out of this image, but right here in the lower front part of this, in the original full-scale image, are oarlocks. So he shot this from inside of the boat, which I have no idea. I couldn't get the water that still with my iPhone. But I love also that, you know, look at what they're all wearing, their little hats, and they're white, full white head to toe. So here's iconic East Hampton. Now, he didn't have a lot of East Hampton, at least that I found that weren't damaged or destroyed. Some of them did have damage. I cropped down and you can see some of those throughout. So this is a pretty iconic image that everyone who's come into town kind of recognizes instantly. There's the hook mill. And I love that they still have the overpass here. So this one, unfortunately, this part of the image was damaged, and I had to crop it down, but the original shot had all of that there. It just was damaged beyond repair. Oh, this guy, he's got a wheelbarrow there, and overalls, and his hands in his pockets. You can see how muddy the streets must have gotten after a good rainstorm, too. The windmill house. So this is the only image where he's got a shadow of himself here with the camera set up, shooting Home Sweet Home. Yeah. The ivy was taking over now. I like that it says Shinnecock Road or Hill Street, whatever you want. And then it says Canoe Place, 6 miles, and Indian Reservation, 2 miles. So this is W.G. Howard, his daughter, his only daughter. And her name was Florence Howard. And she has an interesting story that kind of relates to everything involved with how I came about these glass plate negatives. So, to begin, Howard lived in the early 1900s with his wife and his daughter in their home/studio on Washington Street. In the early 1900s, at about 1904, Howard's wife moved to Bridgeport, Connecticut. When she left, he was left in the home with his daughter, Florence. Florence, there's an interesting first part. In 1904, there was an announcement in the local paper about Florence being wed. A week later, there was another announcement by W.G. Howard that said this announcement of a wedding was a practical joke by somebody, but we don't know who. And then on December 30th, which was 10 days after that announcement came out, an announcement said that Howard had denied the wedding. So it kind of lends you to think that he might have been controlling her. Fast forward, later on in 1907, Florence marries a man by the name of James Nelson. James Nelson used to be a mate on a ship called the Nantasket. Now, the Nantasket used to go to Greenport and around New London, and it used to do all the local stops. It was a steamship, paddle wheel ship. He was 24. She married him, and less than a year later, 9 months later, James gets ill and sick with a unknown stomach problem. He had had the stomach problem, some say up to a year before, but we know about 10 months. And then after vomiting blood, he suddenly dies. Okay. Now this was in March of 2008, so they'd been married approximately 10 months. So James dies, and Florence, in her early 20s then, is a young widow. A few years later, Florence marries a gentleman by the name of William Holtz. Now, William Holtz used to work at the watch case factory, and William only, after 58 days being married to young Florence, came down with stomach problems. And not long after that, William died in February of 1911. So she was married to him they married on December 31st, 58 days later. In February, he died of acute stomach problems. Now, the interesting thing that they put in the papers about young William was that he was a strong, rugged man, built and very healthy. Now, he complained of his stomach problems and vomited blood and died. So, fast forward, Flo, twice widowed, awful luck, moves back in with her father, W.G. Howard, on Washington Street. Now, she was described as a tall woman with a very erect carriage. I guess that's how they would describe a well-built woman, erect carriage, and very robust. She had also grown up in Sag Harbor and attended all of the local schools. She participated in local theater, she received really good grades, was active in the church, and had several close female friends in the village. However, few people referred to her as a man-hater. So shortly after returning to her father's home, she linked up with a woman by the name of Isabel Quackenbush. Can't make this up, it's history. Okay, so Isabel was also a native of Sag Harbor, and she was a widow. And according to the newspaper, Quackenbush spent most of her time in the Howard home with Florence, and the two became inseparable. Florence was working as an agent selling tea and coffee and supplementing her income by doing laundry for neighbors and for friends. Okay, so in 1914, W.G. Howard starts experiencing stomach problems. The only man of the house and the only one that was really making any real income. So he suddenly developed violent stomach cramps, and his condition deteriorated. He was taken to Southampton Hospital for treatment. During his stay, his attending physicians received an anonymous warning letter. The letter was written in pencil, and it was described as being written from a feminine hand. It was composed by an educated person and sent from out of state, likely to be anonymous. And it was only signed with the initial M. So, this is the summary of the letter. It said, "I had information yesterday that compelled me to write to you." Now, this was written to the physicians at Southampton Hospital. "If you want to cure Mr. Howard or save him a slow death, then you better take him away from the home immediately. If necessary, show him this letter. Do anything to save his life. This is no idle gossip or talk. That is all I can say." Okay, so at this time, W.G. Howard was the treasurer of the Phoenix Ladder Company in Sag Harbor. Now, he hadn't been making any money over the last year because of his on and off illness. So he ends up taking money from Phoenix Company to pay his bills, being the treasurer he had access to. Now, the doctor who received the letter from the anonymous woman's hand wrote the district attorney in Riverhead at the time. The district attorney, his name was Mr. Green. Mr. Green had already been warned of the same situation about Howard from Howard's brother, who was the chief of police in Greenport. And he said that they, in order to save his life, they should, get him out of the house. Well, it didn't help. He got better. His stomach pains went away in the hospital, and he recovered. Then he was sent home with a recommendation of getting a private nurse to look after him and care for him. So District Attorney Green took that as an opportunity to send a detective from Brooklyn by the name of Miss Maddie Clark undercover to live with Howard and look after him. So Miss Maddie Clark moves in with the family. She's placed in the house, and she's conducting surveillance and looking for any suspicious activity. But it didn't take long, because soon after Howard was in the house, his stomach troubles returned, and he died shortly after. So the District Attorney Green didn't reveal who the Mrs. Maddie Clark was a police officer, so nobody knew that there was an undercover with them. But she hadn't seen anything that could prove one way or another whether the daughter or the daughters, Mrs. Quackenbush, had anything to do with the death. But there were letters sent to the paper basically calling her out as a murderess, and more letters sent. The DA brought in people that they suspected of writing the original letter, and through all their investigations, which took about 7 months, they decided that there was no evidence of 24 known chemicals that he was checked for, or any motivation, financial or otherwise, for her to do any harm to her father. So the case was closed, and she was let off the hook. And then she wrote a letter basically to the townspeople, because everyone had pretty much pegged her as everyone's killer, where she told everybody that, see, I told you so, I had nothing to do with it. And then she quickly moved to Brooklyn with Mrs. Quackenbush, where they were listed in several other publications from churches and other fundraisers as, in one they're referred to as a couple, and another one they're referred to as sisters. But at some point they broke up in the 1920s, and she moved to East Hampton, where she resided until she died in 1943, or in 36. So nothing was ever found of her being a black widow or the murderer of her father. And they're all buried in Oakland Cemetery. But the pictures. So I don't know that the daughter had anything to do with what was happening there, because she quickly moved out of Washington Street. So I don't think she knew about them, because those may have been a means to have an income, because some of the things I found were random letters from people throughout the community who would say, here's $5, can you send me the photograph that you took this time, blah, blah, blah. So I think it was always a means to make money, and if she had the trove, I would assume that she would use that as an income, being that she was reduced to laundry and selling coffee before. And I can't imagine anybody hired her after they had all deemed her a black widow. But that story went with the negatives untold. So all we know is that they got tucked away into the Brown family's barn, and we found them, and now we get to share them. So, and then one last picture. So I still have not gone through all of the pictures of the people, and I'm just scratching the surface. I have probably a couple thousand of these to go through. And here's a great example. I'm really excited about it because I think it shows people in their natural surroundings and being, just characters taken off the streets and photographed like this fisherman seems to be. And hopefully we'll be able to do the work and in a couple more years come out with just images of the people to share as well. So that's the story.
take any questions. I think we have a mic that, is there a mic to? Charlie, is there?
I was just curious where you had these beautiful glass negatives.
Where I had them printed?
Yeah.
For the book? Or?
Yeah, or just
Oh,
when you
where?
found an image you thought you were interested in. Who did you take it to print it out?
Oh, I use a company called Tricolor in Comac. I worked with a couple of different people, and he's been doing them for me. Does an incredible job. Yeah, he's really good. It's called Tricolor Imaging, and I believe it's in Comac. Yeah, you're welcome.
What size were the glass plate negatives? Were
So
they different sizes or?
They were. There are a couple of different sizes. In some cases, 3 different sizes, but most of them, I would say the large majority of them are going to be 5 by 7, roughly, or a little off.
What happened to the Brown property in the barn?
So they sold it. That's why we were emptying the barn, and yeah, they sold it before it was in contract when we emptied the barn. That was part of the deal. And then I had heard that they had applied for a permit to turn the barn into a yoga studio, but that wasn't happening because apparently that barn has historical significance itself because it's one of the 2 oldest barns on Long Island, still erected.
So it's still there.
Yeah, it's still erected.
So the photographs, Sag Harbor looks like a very prosperous village. Where did all this wealth come from? Besides, I mean, the whaling was over by then, right?
Right, but it had a huge industry at the time. All this industry had built up around the whaling. So in order for them to have all of the preparation, they manufactured the ships, everything. All this manufacturing just turned over into different areas. So I have a picture, and you'll see it in the book, of a shot from North Haven looking to Sag Harbor, and there are smokestacks and white and black smoke going off everywhere. So you had the watch case factory that was running. You had several of the manufacturers. You saw the pictures of the Malloy building, which, you know, they were on the side. You can see the full picture. They have a mill there where they're cutting down wood. On some of the other pictures, they've got ships where they're bringing off the raw logs. They're taking them right to the mill. So there was so much industry producing. And if you realize that the railroad was coming right up into town, literally into Main Street, because all of those places had an outlets for raw materials coming and raw materials going. So it was quite industrious. And that's why the legacy of that is our horrific groundwater, our multiple Superfund sites. I mean, there's so much pollution in Sag Harbor left over from that industrious age after whaling that, you know, we're still hurting from it now. If we have a huge rainstorm and you go down Bay Street, you can see the oil and everything just coming up out of the ground. So yeah, that's the legacy.
I was surprised to see that although the streets were muddy, the sidewalks were paved. They looked so beautiful and white and paved.
Yeah.
So how did that happen? So this
Yeah.
was back in the early 1900s.
Right, yeah. Now, you saw like throughout Main Street and even in the East Hampton pictures from, there is one photograph, I didn't have it in here, but it's down here, there's a low part by the pond, and they had actually built a walkway above the low parts coming across, and there's a Victorian family walking across it. So I think they put a lot into it, because thinking about how many people just to get around, I didn't have a lot of images here, but there's a ton of just bicycles. So I would imagine a lot of the bicycles use those routes on the sidewalks and everything rather than the muddy roads. So
Yeah.
pedestrian traffic, yeah.
Even Main Street, the photos you showed us of Main Street, Sag Harbor, they had beautiful white sidewalks on the side and then muddy roads. So I don't know when the roads would have been.
Yeah, and a lot of what was done was done, you know, with, so for example, Mrs. Russell Sage donating the library the parks and everything else. So, and then like I told you about, the gentleman that donated the flagpole. So I think there was a lot of private money that came in to make the area better.
Whatever happened to the guns that were the fence?
I don't know. I thought about that myself. I was fascinated with that after I read about and identified the photograph. I was like, I would love to know where those went. Yeah, somebody probably threw them along the harbor. Well, it was funny when Gene held, when they were dredging the harbor several years back, and they were taking everything that they were dredging up over to Havens Beach. Jean Held would go over there and just go through all of it. And she had such a collection of just the most amazing things. And you would think, like, everyone just threw their teacups overboard? I mean, the things she found in there were amazing, but that seemed to be a dump.
So the massive collection of photographs he has, were they just for his pleasure, or would he sell them? Or
No, it was a business. It was,
so
yeah.
So he was assigned to certain places to take photographs?
Well, so that's the interesting part. I think, from what I could tell, and this is just me deciphering the work, he made his money on the portrait photography. And I think everything else he did he did have some photographs that ended up in being used as postcards, okay? There were some of those, but very few compared to the body of work. I think a lot of that was him being an artist and him, kind of photographing the lifestyle. And I think ultimately was his legacy, was his eye and the way he put things together. And I think it was beyond just being a portrait photographer. I mean, you can see the way he laid things out, his context, everything that he did as an artist. I don't think there was money for at the time, because no one's going to, take a picture of Main Street and then sell it to me. I don't think that was really. I think maybe the homes too. I can see people paying for those, and there's a lot of homes in the book you'll see. I can see people asking to be paid for those, but other than people, I didn't see in any of the paperwork that I had gone through any requests for anything other than portrait photography.
It's fascinating that he captured the light at a certain time of the day on some of the streets.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what's known about this area, the light reflecting.
It's true. That's the one thing that runs between most artists that talk about doing work on the East End is the light, and it's apparent in a lot of the images, and it's apparent in most of the outside work that he does. But I'm still puzzled. There's a picture of him that he took at the North Haven Artist Colony that can't be taken from a tree. It's too high. They didn't have planes that really good. I don't know how he did it unless he had a balloon. But it's so high up that it's looking down, and it's people playing croquet. It's in the book.
I saw that picture and it made me think it's like a drone shot, and I wondered
Yeah.
how he took it.
I have no
It caught my
idea.
attention as well.
Yeah, because there's no, when you think about what he was dealing with at the time, I thought, well, did he climb to the top of a 200-foot tree with his box camera? I have no idea. I'm so stumped on that. But it does. It looks like a drone shot. And it's perfectly, he staged it where there's people playing croquet, and you've got a maid and a man mowing the lawn with a push mower. And it's a beautifully staged photograph, but I just don't know how he took it. So, there's a lot of those that you'll be on there.
It's interesting, I think this is the second trove that's been found in recent years. Weren't there some daguerreotypes that were found in a barn in Peconic a couple of years ago as well?
I thought it was in Azarest.
Okay.
But I think, and there was several African American photographs from him as well. And that's one of the interesting things too, is the cultural diversity in the photographs, because there's some amazing images of the most well-dressed African Americans you've ever seen of the time, which is quite amazing. And then there was also Asian pictures of Asians throughout. So I'm excited to get to that point of getting through all the people and seeing what. I found one that I'm almost positive is a Shinnecock as well. So I'd love to find more of those, hopefully.
Do we expect another book?
Yeah, definitely. The people for sure, because it's I have just barely scratched the surface of the people, literally.
I'm assuming you don't know the identities of the
people?
No, that's going to be a big mystery, but hopefully with the help of people who... There's a funny story. I was in a home in Sag Harbor where they were renovating the house, and it had a lot of historical significance. And I was in there with the realtor, and they had a photo, and it's one of the photos from my book, and it was the guy who's probably in his, let's say, early 70s, but it was his grandfather, and it was a picture of him playing football, and he's down in a position as like a guard, and there's a bunch of Sag Harbor men playing football, love blues, and that was his grandfather, and it just happened to come across. So I think there's going to be a lot of that, hopefully, because that's the only way. There's no documentation of this is this. The negatives were standing on end, stacked on top of each other, just as tight. You couldn't slip a credit card between them. Part of the challenge in taking them was trying to remove them without breaking them, or removing them without damaging and cracking them through, which, you know, we worked out lots of different ways. We used an air compressor. I read up on every way to possibly do these things because they didn't use acid paper. There are several of the photographs of people where he used the acid paper, but I think that was to preserve so that they could be resold. But I would say out of the thousands made, there's maybe like 50 of them.
Have you come across any photos of people after they died in the studio?
No, not yet. No, I'm curious about that. But ultimately, we're going to archive them and go through them all, and then I'll be donating them to probably the East Hampton Library, so they can be preserved for future generations and not lost again, or in private collection. So I'll enjoy getting to see them all. That's the one thing, when you photograph them for the first time, and this is another trick, I tried every way possible to photograph these things with my big fancy cameras and all my lenses, and I would order another lens, and because you have to put them on a light box, and and the scanners I was using, I bought different scanners, none of them worked. All these are done with an iPhone, which I couldn't believe the quality. I'd shoot them and then go, wow. But then taking those and putting them in the computer and inverting them for the first time and seeing them, that's where I get chills almost every time. It's just, that's where the magic happens. You get to look back into history and see. And so now you can too. You can look through the book and check it out. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Randy. And do you still have one or two books?
Yeah, and if not, we only did a limited edition run of 500 of the books, and we're not going to do any more. So I think we're down to between 100 and 150 left, and then our next project will be the people. So if you want them, we have them available at the store in Sag Harbor. So.
Well, thank you again, and please join us February 9th for our next in the winter lecture series, where Mia Chertik will talk about the story of the homicide. Back here, February 9th, 7 o'clock.